For years, audiences have observed Kody Brown moving through life with an air of unquestioned authority, presenting himself as the central figure whose voice carried the final word in every situation. His identity, both on and off screen, appeared to revolve around control of narrative, control of relationships, and most notably, control of perception. He cultivated an image of dominance that relied heavily on intensity, volume, and an expectation of loyalty that left little room for independence. Within this framework, any deviation was often interpreted as disobedience, and any challenge as a direct threat to his position. Yet, beneath that carefully maintained exterior, there has always been a sense that this authority depended less on genuine confidence and more on the reactions of those around him. Remove the reactions, remove the compliance, and the structure begins to falter. That is precisely what makes the recent encounter with Yanel's reported fiancé so compelling. It was not a dramatic clash filled with raised voices or overt hostility. Rather, it was a quiet, almost understated moment that exposed the fragility of performative dominance. According to circulating reports, Kody entered the situation with a clear intention: to assert himself, to establish a hierarchy, and to remind everyone present that, despite the changes in circumstance, he still believed himself to be the defining authority in Yanel's life. Having already faced the emotional and symbolic impact of her departure, which many interpret as a significant shift in his long-standing dynamic, this meeting carried an added layer of urgency. It was not merely about interaction. It was about reclaiming a narrative that had begun to slip beyond his control. Insiders suggest that in the lead-up to this encounter, there had been a notable effort on his part to gather information about the new man, as though identifying flaws might restore a sense of superiority. Yet, what he encountered instead was an absence of spectacle. A figure who existed outside the usual cycle of attention, uninterested in publicity, and seemingly unaffected by the tensions that often define such situations. This lack of vulnerability created an unexpected challenge. Without visible insecurity to exploit, there was no obvious entry point for the familiar tactics that had previously proven effective. Nevertheless, the attempt was made. Approaching with the confidence of someone accustomed to setting the tone, Kody reportedly initiated the interaction in a manner that suggested both warning and judgment, framing Yanel's independence as a difficulty to be managed. It was a statement layered with assumption, an expectation that it would resonate, that it would create alignment, or at the very least, provoke a reaction. Instead, it was met with something entirely different. Rather than agreement, defensiveness, or confrontation, the response was measured, calm, and quietly self-assured. There was no need to counter the claim because the premise itself was not accepted. That subtle refusal to engage on the same terms altered the dynamic immediately. In that moment, the anticipated exchange dissolved, replaced by an atmosphere in which one individual remained composed while the other was left without a clear path forward. What unfolded in the immediate aftermath of that encounter only intensified the contrast that had already begun to take shape, turning what might have been dismissed as a brief, inconsequential meeting into something far more revealing. Rather than dissipating, the tension seemed to linger, not because of any overt conflict, but because of the absence of it. For someone who has long relied on heightened emotion, raised voices, and visible displays of authority to command attention, the lack of engagement presented a uniquely destabilizing challenge. Reports suggest that, in those moments following the initial exchange, there was a visible shift in demeanor. The expected escalation never arrived, and without it, there was no familiar framework within which to operate. This created what observers often describe as a silent stalemate, though in reality it was anything but equal. One individual remained entirely at ease, grounded in his own sense of self, while the other appeared increasingly unsettled by the inability to provoke a reaction. It is in such imbalances that deeper truths tend to surface. Without the usual tools of dominance, interruption, volume, and intensity, the facade of control becomes difficult to maintain. Instead, what remains is a raw, unfiltered moment in which body language, tone, and restraint speak louder than any words could. According to those familiar with the situation, this moment was captured in full, without the dramatic edits or narrative framing that often accompany televised interactions. The absence of embellishment allowed the scene to stand on its own, revealing a dynamic that required no additional commentary to be understood. Observers later noted the stark contrast between the two figures, one displaying subtle signs of agitation, rigid posture, fixed gaze, and an almost palpable need to regain footing, while the other maintained a relaxed stance, unhurried movements, and a complete lack of visible tension. These details, though small in isolation, collectively painted a clear picture. They suggested not merely a difference in temperament, but a fundamental difference in how each individual defines strength. Where one equated strength with control and dominance, the other embodied it through composure and self-assurance. This distinction did not need to be articulated. It was evident in every moment of stillness. In an apparent attempt to recover from this unexpected turn, attention reportedly shifted towards the cameras. This pivot was not entirely surprising, as the presence of an audience, real or perceived, has often served as a means of reasserting narrative control. By addressing the situation externally, there is an opportunity to reshape its interpretation, to frame events in a manner that aligns with a preferred perspective. However, in this instance, such efforts appeared to have the opposite effect. Comments that may have been intended to project authority instead revealed underlying assumptions about relationships, independence, and control. By characterizing mutual respect as a form of weakness, the narrative inadvertently highlighted the very mindset that had contributed to the earlier imbalance. Rather than restoring credibility, it reinforced the contrast that had already been established. Observers were quick to recognize this, noting that the attempt to reclaim dominance through commentary lacked the impact of the earlier, unspoken exchange. Meanwhile, the response from Yanel's fiancé, as described in various accounts, continued to follow a markedly different pattern. There was no attempt to engage in a public back and forth, no visible interest in prolonging the situation, and no indication of a need to defend either himself or Yanel. Instead, his approach remained consistent, calm, measured, and grounded in quiet confidence. When addressed indirectly through remarks or questions, his responses were reportedly concise and focused, emphasizing respect, partnership, and an appreciation for independence. One particular statement, widely discussed among observers, encapsulated this perspective with striking simplicity. By describing Yanel as someone who knows her own mind and expressing gratitude for the circumstances that led to their connection, he effectively reframed the entire narrative. Traits that had once been portrayed as challenges were instead presented as strengths, qualities to be valued rather than managed. This reframing required no confrontation. It simply offered an alternative viewpoint that resonated more strongly because of its authenticity. The impact of this approach extended beyond the immediate interaction. As accounts of the encounter circulated, attention increasingly shifted towards the broader implications. Analysts and commentators began to examine not just what had happened, but what it represented. At its core, the situation highlighted a fundamental difference between two models of masculinity. One rooted in assertion and control, the other in stability and mutual respect. The former relies on external validation, requiring constant reinforcement through dominance and recognition. The latter, by contrast, is self-sustaining, requiring no such validation because it is not dependent on comparison or hierarchy. This distinction became the focal point of much discussion, with many noting that the absence of confrontation did not diminish the significance of the encounter, it enhanced it. By refusing to engage in conflict, the fiancé effectively removed the stage upon which such displays typically unfold.